So now I would like to bring Brian Savage into our conversation. Brian is the CEO of Electric Metals, a US-based mineral development company with manganese and silver projects focused on supporting the transition to clean energy. Brian, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Anya. It's great to be here. That was an absolutely great overview of the critical minerals sector. Thank you for that.
My pleasure. So maybe you can dive into more details in difference between strategic and critical minerals. I know I kind of like highlighted the maybe some bullet points, but since you're in the industry, let's put it this way, you can dive deeper into the subject.
Sure. If you could bring up that slide deck so people
Yeah.
could see some of those. If we move to the next slide, just to give you guys an overview of what I'd like to quickly talk about. The big question is, how do we get here? We need to understand how we got here to make sure that we know where we're going. The law of unintended consequences. Where are the minerals mined and processed? And I think that Anya gave a great overview of that. And then we'll touch on the critical and strategic minerals. So next slide, please. How did we get here? Yeah, it didn't happen overnight. If you go back to the 1940s, it's pretty much the World War II war effort. The U.S. industry in particular had an integrated domestic supply chain, and they developed world-class R&D. Then we marched down the track, and in the 1960s, environmental activism started, and that was really the demand for clean air and clean water. And as a result of that, the US EPA was formed in the 1970s, and they really started forcing all companies, not just mining companies, chemical companies, processing companies, to clean up their act. The 1970s, as a result of that, was really a decade of not in my backyard. And that started moving the mineral supply, the processing, and all the R&D outside of the UN, outside the US, primarily over to China. And so, we're marching down the track in the 1970s. We're merrily pushing everything out of the country. And then in 2010, a little bit of a wake-up call for some people anyway, was the China-Japan rare earth trade war, where I think China was doing some fishing in the Japanese waters, and they didn't like that. And so basically what happened was China withheld rare earths to Japan, and that had a severe impact on the Chinese economy. Should have been a big wake-up call. I don't think so. Then we move into the 2020, and that's when COVID really exposed the vulnerability of supply chains and threw a big monkey wrench into what you might call the just-in-time inventory situation. 2022, Europe woke up to the folly of relying on Russian gas as a result of Russia's invasion into Ukraine. And then also, I think in 2022 was really when the United States finally started waking up to the fact that it realized that it had exported its mineral supply, its processing, and its R&D 50 years ago. And now what do? They had a lot of catch up to do. So next slide, please. The law of unintended consequences goes back to the climate change situation. And people are saying it's being caused by the hydrocarbons and carbon. And so hydrocarbons and carbons are out. Climate change demands a green energy transition. And you combine that with social mood, government regulation, and incentives, and that's driving the electrification of everything to get rid of the hydrocarbons. Now, once you start electrifying everything, that's driving the demand for the minerals that are critical. And those are all the minerals that you were just talking about in order to have this green energy transition. And then the policymakers wake up, oops, we don't produce them anymore. So now what are we going to do? And that creates the critical minerals rush. And that requires now in my backyard. And that's why we have the list of all the various critical minerals, because we stopped producing them, we stopped processing them, and now we need them in order to have our green energy transition. So we move to the next slide. I think Anya, you did a superb job with listing out where the critical minerals are mined and processed. But just to focus in on a few of them, Indonesia has about 60% of the world's nickel. The Congo's got about 80% of the world's cobalt. Although Bolivia and Argentina are really have the largest resources of lithium in the world, it's really Australia who's producing the most, and then I think Chile comes in the next. And the real issue is that China really processes the majority of our critical minerals, and the world is pretty much reliant on China for all of those minerals that are required for the green energy transition. And we move on to the next slide. The difference between the critical and strategic minerals, as you had mentioned, most countries have their own designations of what they consider critical. The EU in particular, as you mentioned, has designated 34 minerals as critical, and those are the ones that are important for the EU economy and face a risk of disruption, primarily because of the supply chains and where they're located and where they're processed. And they designated 17 of those 34 as strategic because of their importance and global demand and supply imbalances. And again, that gets right back to the various supply disruptions. From a function of how do you incentivize that, we discussed in a previous slide that it's government incentives. I think the United States is probably the leader with the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and that's really creating a lot of investment demand into the United States, and in some cases, at the disadvantage of Europe, the Nordic countries, because there's so much incentive to come here.
All right, well, thank you so much, Brian. We'll get back to Brian in the end of the webinar. I would like to ask him like some follow-up questions, but I would like our next speaker also will join us, so please stay with us.